Airing on Asheville FM in Asheville, North Carolina, this is The Final Straw, a weekly anarchist and anti-authoritarian broadcast and podcast emanating out of occupied Tsalagi land in southern Appalachia. We bring you voices from struggles for liberation from all around the world. Welcome. This week on the show, we're featuring a few segments. First up, Chaz speaks about the website uprisingsupport.org, which shares the names and cases of people criminalized in relation to the George Floyd uprising of 2020 across the so-called USA, as well as the importance of growing a culture of anti-repression and resistance. Then, for this year's June 11th Day of Solidarity with Marius Mason and all long-term anarchist prisoners, you'll hear supporters read statements by Toby Schoen in the so-called UK and Dan Baker, as well as a statement from Sean Swain in the so-called USA. You can find more on June 11th, announcements of celebrations, interviews with and about some of the featured prisoners, and poster and sticker designs at june11.org. In our show notes, you can find links to past interviews we've done with and about some of these anarchist prisoners, anti-repression work, and June 11th. One really quick announcement. Our comrades at Anarchist Black Cross Belarus are out of funds required to support prisoners resisting the Lukashenko dictatorship. You can learn more, including how to support ABC Belarus, at abc-belarus.org and find the post entitled "No One Will Be Left Alone," or you could find the link in our show notes. Finally, the June 2022 issue of Fire Ant Journal, which is themed around June 11th and Anarchist Prisoner Solidarity, is now available. You can download it for reading or reproduction at bloomingtonabc.noblogs.org. And please consider getting a benefit t-shirt for Fire Ant, available via a link in our show notes. And now for some words from Anarchist Prisoner Sean Swain.
What you say, what you say, what you say, what?
The United States doesn't have a violence problem. The United States is a violence problem. It appears that everyone gets caught in cycles of their own assumptions, and those assumptions then serve as a distraction, leading us all away from the real causes of the real problems. And until we have an honest discussion of the real underlying causes of the real problems leading to our violence, we'll never have a solution. People on TV complain that the National Rifle Association owns Congress, and until the NRA shifts away from its extreme stances on guns, there will never be effective gun control that will curb the violence. That seems to be a popular consensus, but let's unpack some of the assumptions there. First, while it may be true that Congress is a sock puppet to the NRA, it's also true that the NRA is a sock puppet to its membership. For several decades now, the NRA has attempted to shift away from extreme positions. But when it does, the NRA loses members to the smaller and more extreme fringe groups. Whenever that happens, the NRA then shifts back to the extreme in order to gain its members back. So the problem isn't the NRA leadership's extremism. The problem there is that the NRA and other groups are held hostage by millions of angry white guys with guns. The other assumption in what was said is that if not for the NRA, Congress could pass effective gun control to curb the violence. The fact is, there is no proof that any legislation could impact the violence. Total bans on assault rifles and other weapons of mass killing, hell, a total ban on selling any guns from this day forward wouldn't stop the violence. There are already hundreds of millions of guns out there in circulation in the hands of Americans. If we stop selling guns now, that will possibly impact gun violence decades from now, but it won't do anything today or tomorrow or next week. Background checks and other such screening tools might make it more difficult for mass shooters to get guns, but again, there are already guns everywhere. Where there's a will, there's a way. Which brings us to another assumption, that the problem is the guns. It's not. Other countries like Canada have similar per capita gun ownership ratios to the United States. But when we experienced more than 200 mass shootings in 2002, Canada had still experienced zero. Nowhere else in the world does a high accumulation of guns translate into an epidemic of mass shootings. Nowhere. Just the United States. The guns don't load themselves. The guns don't transport themselves to schools and malls, to churches and supermarkets. The guns don't aim and pull their own triggers. It takes a human being to take the guns to a mass shooting event, to aim the guns, to pull the triggers. More often than not, the human being who does the aiming and the shooting is an angry white guy. There are a few exceptions, a few departures from the rule, but the shooters are so often angry white men that it would be far more honest to say that the United States has an angry white man problem, not a gun problem. The availability of guns to angry white men makes the body counts higher, perhaps, but the absence of guns wouldn't make the killing stop. Heather Heyer was killed by an angry white man. So was George Floyd and Emmett Till. Guns weren't their causes of death. You can't outlaw muscle cars and baseball bats and ropes and kneecaps. All of those things are deadly weapons when used by angry white men. Taking all the guns away from angry white men, good luck with that, by the way, taking all their guns wouldn't instill in them any greater regard for human life than they have now. You'd only force them to get more imaginative in how to accomplish the mass killing. Maybe mixing cow shit and diesel fuel like their angry white guy martyr, Timothy McVeigh. So, in furtherance of getting to the bottom of the angry white man problem plaguing the United States, I have a theory. It goes like this. White privilege and male privilege are very real. Our culture speaks reassuringly to white males from the cradle, through schooling, and into adulthood, reinforcing a sense of their indisposability. The world needs them. They're promised to occupy the commanding heights of our universe. They matter even when no one else does. Then, they find themselves in lives that lack purpose, meaning, or importance. They feel betrayed, alienated, rendered irrelevant. Now, the fact is everyone else gets kicked in the face too. Non-white people, women and female-identifying folks. The difference is, on some level, everyone but white men have grown accustomed to getting kicked in the face. In fact, they expect it. Realistically, everyone but white men realize that's just how this world works. But white men, indoctrinated to believe in their singular exceptionalism, buying into their own entitlement, see a more sinister agenda at work. The world has conspired against white men and turned on them. They really believe that. They're driven by an animosity toward women and non-whites, everyone who has encroached upon their traditional and customary monopoly on prosperity, everyone who has nibbled on the piece of the pie that's always reserved for them. A lot of cultural messages reinforce their white male rage. They hate Me Too and Black Lives Matter and critical race theory, whatever that is, and they vote for Trump, the white male messiah whose MAGA slogan translates to them as a promise to put white men back at the top where they belong. I'm reminded of the angry white men marching with tiki torches the night before Heather Heyer's death. Remember what they were chanting? You will not replace us. And they now express their white male rage ultimately with guns. Nothing more phallic than guns. And so, why is this so uniquely an American problem? Well, where else have white men had the unique privilege historically of taking the land and exterminating anyone in the way, of chaining others as a workforce without so much as an apology, experiencing unique and unquestioned transcendence until now? Where else is there white male violence celebrated as it is in the United States? Where? There are uniquely toxic and festering wounds from the inception of this country, and we've never honestly discussed them or addressed them. And those with the biggest package of privileges have the most to lose by this looming impending dialogue about colonization and slavery and the white male violence at the heart of it all. That, I suspect, is what drives this epidemic. Until we call out and critically analyze our angry white man problem and all of the issues that drive it, we can expect a steady body count, no matter what other so-called solutions we try to employ. This is Anarchist Prisoner Sean Swain from the Super Duper Uber Mega Ultra Hyper Turbo Maxi Multimax in Youngstown, Ohio. If you're listening, you are the resistance.
You can still write Sean at his new old new again address at Sean Swain number A243205 OSP Youngstown 878 Coitesville Hubbard Road, Youngstown, Ohio 44505. You can find his past writings, updates on his case, hear his past audio, find out how to get his books, plus ways to contribute to his legal defense fund at SeanSwain.org. Psst. You can Cash App $Swaniac 1969 or send dough to us and comment that it's for Swain's defense. More info is also available on Instagram at Swaniac 1969 or Twitter at SwainRocks.
Hi, yeah, my name is Chaz, and I work with this website that we're going to talk about today called uprisingsupport.org. And that's probably the biggest affiliation that makes the most sense in this moment to talk about. I have a background in anti-repression and prisoner support organizing inside the U.S.
I mean, I bandy about the term anti-repression, and it seems kind of self-explanatory, but can you talk a little bit about how that is as a framework to operate from? Does it differ? Because I mean, some people go into prisoner support because they're into supporting specific prisoners or hate a specific facility, but can you talk about the idea of anti-repression work?
Yeah, so anti-repression work, I think honestly, inside of a U.S. context, it's a little bit ill-defined, it's a little bit poorly defined often, but the way that I tend to use this term, and I think is the most applicable to the context that we're in, is when we say repression, we're talking about state repression. And by talking about anti-repression work, as opposed to focusing on a specific prison or a specific type or group of prisoners that we want to support, or a specific facility, or even a specific mode of repression, we're able to more accurately define and be in conflict with like a larger system of repression. So anti-repression work is like a broad-based method and like a kind of a network of methodologies of responding to and also preemptively stopping state repression against, in our context, we're talking mostly about anarchists and left radicals, but in the context of the website, we're talking about it in a much broader way, and not necessarily limited to talking about people who are taking action in the more classical sense of a political framework. So we're talking about things that are not just focused on a specific aspect of state repression. We're not just talking about jail support. We're not just talking about prisoner support. Things like digital security or security culture or trauma care all kind of go into this broader idea of anti-repression work, because if the state is going to use a ecology of methods to repress us, we need a similar kind of response to that state repression. And so that's kind of the broad-based idea behind anti-repression work, as opposed to talking about singular, anti-prison or prisoner support or jail support or even a bail fund. It's this whole broad idea of that network.
Cool. Thanks for letting me just launch that at you without. Yeah, it seems like abolitionism has been a term that's been used a lot more popularly and a lot more discussed over the last few years. It means a lot of things to a lot of different people. And then people sometimes have to specify police abolitionism, as if those two organizations or those two platforms didn't interact with each other and support each other. So it seems like, and I want to talk about this a little more in a later question, when talking about building sort of anti-repression culture, but it seems like it's kind of approached from this direction of counterinsurgency, which I think is pretty useful because it puts a lot of things onto the table, including what appear to be like violent repression, like police raids, ICE raids, the border regime as a whole. And then also it can also bleed over into addressing softer counterinsurgency stuff, like propaganda and the like.
Yeah, I mean, at the risk of being overly broad, that's kind of like what we're talking about here is anti-repression is like not only a thing that we're striving to see in the world, like, but it's also a tactic. Anti-repression is a tactic, and anti-repression organizing is a tactic that people use in an effort to maintain and further anti-state struggles. It's just a necessary aspect if people are going to be taking, direct actions against state and capital. They're going to need people who are organizing to help keep them safe.
So can you tell us a little bit about uprisingsupport.org, who runs it, how it got started, what it does, and who it supports?
Yeah, so uprisingsupport.org is run by a very, very small collection of people who basically came together because of the need and hadn't necessarily worked together before. And they all, everyone has a background in anti-repression organizing and work and prisoner support. But there's been a lot of stuff that, we've learned just by doing this website that we hadn't encountered before, even with a lot of years of experience. The website specifically is set up to give a space for people to find the information. It's primarily for people who are being held on charges related to the 2020 uprising across the US. And so, that's a pretty big task. The primary people who are up on the site at the moment are almost all federal prisoners, because the federal system is a little bit easier to navigate in terms of finding people. State and county systems make the process much more difficult to track people from arrest to conviction and possible imprisonment. The way in which the website works is that there are some people on the site who have organized outside support campaigns, and that's where the information is drawn from. People in certain places that either had like an active organizing presence, like earlier in the uprisings, who created support campaigns and support crews, or leaned on already existing organizing in 2020 to create these kind of like groups of people who are doing long-term prisoner support for people criminalized during the uprising. That's where some of our information comes from. And then the people who don't have those connections to prior organizing or don't have connections to a support campaign are on the site because we've reached out. We found their information through a variety of means. A lot of it's media. We'll read an article, note down someone's name, and then continue to try and follow their case. And then once they are reachable in a system, usually the federal system, we reach out, explain what the site is, and ask if they want to be added to it. Those come with certain caveats, and we try and be clear about exactly who the site is geared towards. The site is, obviously geared towards a left audience, and we want people to be aware that, when they put their information up on the site, it's going to get reproduced in places that are like primarily trafficked by like anarchists and radicals and leftists. Some like basic information about the site, and we ask if people want to be listed. It sounds pretty straightforward, but prison doesn't make it very easy to interact with people on the outside. So there's actually a lot of roadblocks to be able to do this. Just tracking someone through the system is fairly difficult. And then kind of the scope and scale of the amount of people that were criminalized during the 2020 uprising, into 2021. The uprising was ongoing in a lot of places, so we had to come up with a time frame. And so, we talk about the uprising itself in many ways going in, from May 2020 until the election. That's kind of our time frame that we talk about in terms of like uprising prisoners, in an effort to kind of keep the site scalable, like keep it within our means, and to give some kind of like periodized context for what we mean by the uprising, even though clearly there was many actions and the uprising continued past that point for many places.
Yeah, and police killings haven't stopped, and people continue to go out for Breonna Taylor and other folks who.
Yeah, like this is not, we're not trying to necessarily call in every single person who's been criminalized in the wake of a police shooting. That's an incredible amount of people with a much longer history than the site could possibly cover.
Yeah, that seems like a really good lesson of like putting down a boundary and not expanding past capacity, since I think that's a hard thing for especially newer activists to realize, is like, how do we do the good thing and then also recognize that we can only do so much and do that well?
And I think there's also a certain amount of responsibility that goes into doing work with people who are currently, imprisoned by the state. Holding yourself to boundaries and holding to yourself to like a certain level of like accountability to doing what you said you were going to do, is the stakes are much, much, much higher when you're offering support and kind of a service to people who are incarcerated. That's not something that you can go back on. That's not something that you can really take a break from. That's not something that you can renege because you've overextended yourself. So that's a really important lesson, I think, for people who are moving into prisoner support is, small increments, baby steps, moving at a pace that works well for you, because the project itself is actually another person. And it's not the same as other kinds of projects that we do.
So what I'm hearing you as offering is you're providing a spot where people can come and find information about doing support for prisoners and keeping up updates as you can, or pointing people to resources that would help them along this trail of supporting prisoners and maybe like post-release support if folks are asking for it. Is that right? But you all aren't actually doing as this project as uprisingsupport.org. You're not actually coordinating the immediate support of folks?
No, and we're pretty clear with people when we write them the first time that, we're not providing support. We're not providing a resource beyond basically this public listing. And our hope is that the people who are publicly listed on the site that have support campaigns, this will be another place for those support campaigns to put information so that there's just another way for people to find those campaigns. And the other hope is that people who are in areas where there aren't active support campaigns, but there are active defendants and people in prison from the uprising can find those people and possibly initiate relationships and, possibly support campaigns for those defendants. That's all based on people's capacity and people's working relationships and building those working relationships. But that's kind of a hope of ours, is that people, possibly in places that people didn't focus on during the uprising, but had strong moments and demonstrations and all of these things during the uprising. In those places that maybe, especially if there's less resources or less capacity, folks who aren't necessarily already plugged in, this could be an opportunity for them to reach out to those locked up and plug themselves in.
Cool. That's awesome. For all of us, for our understanding, can you give us a sense of like the scope of how many prisoners faced heavy sentences that your project is aware of, at least as a result of being targeted by the state for alleged participation in the George Floyd uprising?
Yeah, the heaviest sentences definitely came down at the federal level. And that's pretty consistent with, the scale of incarceration in the U.S. also, I think, in a certain sense. It's really hard to say exactly how many people were arrested or charged, but the number of charges that were initially set at the federal level was around 350 people were charged at that level. At the state level, the arrests themselves at kind of this like state and city level were in the, tens of thousands. And so partially because of the pandemic, and some states really did limit the amount of people that they were actually sending to prison for like a brief moment. A lot of those folks ended up in these kind of like e-carceration situations, which is like a whole different topic. But the vast majority of the very serious charges, when we're seeing convictions, and mostly what we're seeing is pleas. There's a extraordinarily high percentage of people in general at the federal level plead their cases out. And those cases that we're seeing with being the most serious, we're seeing a fair amount of, 5 to 10 year sentences stemming from the uprising. And they've slowed down in the last 6 months to a year. The convictions have slowed down a little bit, but out of those 350 people across the country who, or probably more, probably closer to 400, who picked up these federal charges, there's a really high percentage of them either sat in prison for a really long time. We're 2 years in now, right? And so a number of people sat in prison, were not released initially, and then eventually pled to a charge that saw a lot of their time already done. And so we're seeing a fair amount of releases that for people who took prison sentences for, less than 3 years because they sat in prison for 2 years, awaiting sentencing, awaiting trial, and most of them eventually pled out. But there are a number of people who are still actually going in right now, 2 years on, and starting 5 to 10 year sentences. So that's not an uncommon thing to see currently. In terms of exact numbers, it's really hard to say, partially because the whole process is so well obfuscated by the state. It's so well hidden in a certain sense to know exactly how many uprising prisoners there are and how many of them were taken at different levels would require a team of people and probably more energy and people power than most of us have at the moment.
That's an important point. It's important to note that federal prosecutions are a thing that can take a very long time, even besides the way that COVID, messed up the way that the court systems operated. In a lot of ways, and extended out periods that people were being held in pretrial detention. But obviously, because the uprising occurred primarily during the Trump administration, most of the prosecutions, most of the arrests would have happened during that administration. But I think it's also important to note that where the current administration under Biden, the Democrats, does have some leeway to give instruction to federal prosecutors as to how they should move forward with prosecutions, and the prosecutions have continued, or people's sentences haven't been reduced, despite the fact that Trump has been out of office. People are still suffering. Are people still being picked up on charges that relate back to then, like surveillance being presented publicly and then people snitching out folks and charges coming down that you're aware of?
There have been a couple late in the game ones recently. Not a ton in this last kind of 2022 era. 2021 saw it's crazy that we're still talking about, we've got 2 years on this now. In the 2022 era, we're not seeing a ton of new charges coming up. A really high amount of the charges that we saw. And, we haven't tracked every case. Let's keep that in perspective and to keep that in mind in terms of our ability to know kind of the bigger trends. 2021 was a really big year for prosecutions, and it's important, to remember that who was in office in 2021. So 2021 saw a ton of prosecutions. A lot of the cases that involved snitch hotlines, which is unfortunately a ton of cases were well, okay, so yeah, this kind of goes back to when we talk about anti-repression, because a ton of cases came from people accidentally snitching themselves out through social media. It was just a really commonplace thing. And that's a big topic for anti-repression, right? Is talking about how do people keep themselves safe digitally? And then there was, a lot of police and federal investigations that involved tip lines or do you know who this is? Kind of campaigns with when they put up a bunch of photographs of grainy photographs of people inside a Starbucks or something, and they're do you know who these people are? And someone snitches them out. That was a really big problem, I think, in a lot of these cases, kind of, and we don't, you never know who exactly is doing this kind of this work of the state, but it certainly is an element to keep in mind and to think about in terms of countering state repression when it's kind of foisted out on the community, talking about what is anti-repression work when a lot of the cases you're seeing are people who are being sent to prison by other civilians, basically. And I think it is also important to remember that there was a consistent tendency for cases in certain parts of the country to start off as state cases. So a case gets prosecuted at the state level, and they're going through this process, and then all of a sudden the feds, the federal prosecutors step in and they say, actually, this is our case now. We're going to prosecute this at the federal level. And they did that under a handful of reasons. But a really big thing that happened in that kind of 2020 and 2021 era was the Fed stepping in certain parts of the country and saying, because the alleged damage to this building was done, or because it was a cop car, we're going to prosecute this at the federal level because the thing that was damaged was involved in interstate commerce. I mean, it's basically them being like, because a aspect of the thing that was attacked or the thing that was vandalized or yada yada has to do with interstate, like moves in between physical states, the Fed stepped in and prosecuted things that primarily, honestly, are state charges. It's basic vandalism became this thing that was being prosecuted at the federal level because of the nature of the vandalism, because it was politicized. And so, we saw that, and then we saw an incredible use of this civil disorder charge, which, is not in common usage in terms of like federal prosecutions. And so those two elements really, I think, heightened the ways in which this uprising was prosecuted, and also why we saw so many federal arrests for things that, in a different context would have been state charges. And not to say that state charges are better, but they're easier for communities to rally around. They're easier for people to fight legally. They're easier for people to be released pre-trial. There's just like all these aspects to like a federal sentence is like a really, really big deal in a sense, if we're talking about the kind of scale of repression.
Yeah, for sure. And there's just to point to an interview if folks feel like listening to it that we did in June of 2020 with Michael Loadenthal, who was tracking some of the federal prosecutions. That's a point in this Mapping the State Strategy of Repression Against Rebellion article. Also, that was on IGD at the same time, but we'll link that in the show notes. Or maybe I'm incorrect in this, but also another way that they were approaching the federal charges was claiming that because a vehicle was purchased by the police department based from federal funds that were offered.
I mean, yeah, there was one case, there are just so many cases where things like that, they were like, these officers were trained in a facility across state lines, so this is federal, or this gun that was stolen during this riot was manufactured across a state line, or this business that was vandalized does interstate commerce, so this is a federal charge. The law and the state are absurd, but this was just really them showing themselves in this way.
And you've kind of pointed to a couple times like different elements of this, this anti-repression culture or this anti-repression approach, and the different ways, whether it be digital security, as you said, or which can include, again, one way of saying it is snitching on yourself on social media. Another one is posting boastful selfies that do not have context on social media or whatever. But yeah, I wonder if you could talk a little bit about just personally how you conceive of cultures of resistance or cultures of anti-repression, and sort of some things that you feel could be useful in starting the conversation about how to think about it with the people that we care about and the people in our community who we maybe don't even know we're struggling alongside of.
Yeah. So anti-repression work, I think the best way that I can think about or to talk about anti-repression work is to think about it as holistic. So thinking about state repression and attacks on communities in resistance in a way where we can understand that those attacks coming from the state are going to be multifaceted. And so our responses need to be multifaceted. it's similar to the concept of security culture and the thinking that, security culture is not necessarily a list of things to do or not do, but it's a methodology of making decisions for yourself and inside your community and with your community, and to create a broader culture of keeping each other safe. And so anti-repression work, I think, can mean a lot of different things. But I think the, ultimate goal and the ultimate understanding of anti-repression work and how to kind of fit it into whatever it is that you're doing inside your communities is to understand why you're doing it, especially in the fast-paced world of 2020, where it seemed like nothing was going to slow down ever. And it really, for a lot of people, really felt like, the moment a lot of people had been waiting for in terms of upheaval had come, and there was no reason to ever slow down. It is really easy to get into a kind of rut of jumping into action in terms of responding to state repression without necessarily having a long-term strategy or long-term thought process around why it is you're countering that specific repression or fulfilling a specific kind of service that goes into responding to that repression. So this concept of anti-repression strategizing and organizing is kind of making those decisions, like, are we going to start a bail fund? Are we going to be doing jail support? How do we do jail support? Thinking about always going back to this idea of why are we doing anti-repression work? And, for me, this is the best way that I know how to describe it, is that we do anti-repression work so that the rebellion can continue. We don't go and pick people up from jail when they've been arrested because we want to feel good about ourselves or because, but we do that in the context of our revolutionary organizing, because we understand that if we take care of each other, the rebellion that we're seeing and the revolutionary organizing and potential and activity that's happening can possibly continue. And that the only way communities can stay in revolt is if they take care of themselves and there's this network of communities taking care of each other. And so that's a really big part of anti-repression. And, and that's built into this for us, I think, in some ways, in this talking about this website, what does it mean if this incredibly large, incredibly broad rebellion took place across, it took place across time, it took place across space, it took place in this huge way that generationally almost, none of us can really touch in any other way. And then what does it mean if the people who go to prison during that rebellion don't have support? It means a part of the rebellion has ended. But what does it mean if those people do have support, and what kind of connections across community and across communities can be made by doing that kind of support? And I think an important aspect of this is, anti-repression is also the recognition that state repression isn't always a thing that you can keep from happening. And it's up to us to create communities and create cultures where when you are the subject of state repression, when you are being repressed, when you are imprisoned, you're not cut off from the community that you came from. You're not cut off from a community of rebellion. Prisoners have, as a group of people, in a broad way, I can say, they're not out. They're not done. It's not over. They are just in a really different place than those of us out here walking around in the whatever so-called free world. And so a part of anti-repression is going to be also maintaining those relationships, because it's another methodology for us to show care to each other, but also because we want the rebellion to continue. So I think these are really good questions that people should be asking themselves when they start doing anti-repression organizing. There's a lot of basic tools. There's a lot of really know your rights. There's a lot of digital security stuff. There's a lot of how-tos. There's a lot of tips and tricks, and all of those are a part of it. But I think ultimately a big question, I think, is coming back to the center and being of your work and being why are we doing this? and, figuring out what it is about creating strong communities in response to state repression that is the biggest for you, and moving from that position, and that will help create a better culture as opposed to like a set of like rules or like things to do or not do that don't help us build beyond that moment.
Well, Chaz, how can folks support your project? How can they get started or integrate their own ongoing work into something like uprisingsupport.org?
Yeah, please come to the website and take a look around. There's a resources page that has like a lot of information about how to do prisoner support, and like these very kind of bare bones, like very like basic ways about like how to write letters, how to start, that kind of like tips and tricks stuff I was talking about. That's all on the site. But look through the site and, for one, remember that each name on a page is a person, with their own story, background, history, community, family, and try and find ways that you think that you have capacity to like interact with those people. If that's organizing a letter writing night and picking a handful of names, that's great. If that's picking one person and writing to them. For people who are doing support for uprising prisoners, I think that's logistically very helpful for us, is for us to have information sent to us about people's incarceration and updates about their cases. We try and keep the website updated, but there's a lot of people to track, and there's a lot of people that we are tracking that aren't on the site because they haven't reached that point yet. There's a lot of back and forth. And so us not having to keep an eye on everyone's cases really cuts down on our time, and allows us to take the small amount of time that we do have. This is one of many things that we're working on. And so if we have that information sent to us from people who are doing support campaigns, etc., that's really helpful. If you do make a relationship with somebody based off of the website, whether it's, you're in a state and you're like, oh crap, I didn't realize that somebody from the uprising was in prison from my state, and you write them, think about creating a support campaign for people. It's not a light responsibility, but it's a really important one. And I think that the more people that have this kind of inside-outside connection, a lot of folks are supported by their close friends and their families, but a lot of people aren't also, and a lot of people have been on the site, the subjects of state repression coming from their communities for a really long time. The defendants on the website are overwhelmingly Black men coming from like hyper criminalized communities, so a lot of the folks that we talk to have dealt with state repression for a really long time, but I don't know if they've ever had, the support or the backing of other people from either their community or other communities that see commonality in their struggle. And so building those relationships is really important. And then, if you're doing support for somebody and they're not on the site and you think that they should be on the site, please reach out. We try and check the email fairly regularly and let us know, and we'll start working with you or with other people that you're in touch with or prisoners directly to get people listed.
Awesome. Well, anything else that you wanted to touch on? This is going to air alongside of some recordings of anarchist prisoners who were supported by the June 11th Project. So as another tendency within anti-repression more widely, I don't know if you had anything to add. No pressure.
Yeah, no, I think that thinking about the uprising prisoners as long-term prisoners, I think is really important. And so putting that in this context, I think is also really important. It's important to remember that not everybody shares a theoretical political background. And so just keep that in mind in terms of thinking about people as this kind of large group of people who took action against whatever form of the state was in front of them that they were criminalized for. But also keeping in mind that a lot of folks really are entering into this realm of becoming long-term prisoners inside of the federal, especially the federal system. And that's a big deal. And not forgetting that even many, many, many years on, there still will be uprising prisoners. 5 years from now, there will still be uprising prisoners. And keeping that in mind as we move forward as people who care about this.
The Final Straw is a proud member of the Channel Zero network of anarchist podcasts, and here's a jingle from another member of CZN.
What's up, y'all? I'm Pearson, host of Coffee with Comrades. Coffee with Comrades is rooted in militant joy. Our hope is to cultivate a warm and inviting atmosphere, like walking into your favorite coffee shop to sit down with some of your close friends and share a heart-to-heart conversation. New episodes premiere every Tuesday, so be sure to smash that subscribe button wherever you get your podcasts so that you never miss an episode. We are proud to be a part of the Channel Zero Network.
Now, here are some supporters of Anarchist Prisoners reading public statements and responses between Toby Schoen and Dan Baker, to be followed by Sean Swain reading his own statement.
June 11, 2022, statement from Toby Schoen. We will have to go to sea and embark on a journey into the unknown. It is up to us to choose the course from the march. We are free to make mistakes. Gustavo Rodriguez, brief informative report about the weather. An embrace of life, fire, and complicity to all imprisoned anarchist comrades for this June 11th. I have been invited to participate by the comrades in North America, for which they have my thanks and agreement. Whilst I am not condemned to a particularly long sentence, I faced well over a decade at my trial last October in Operation A Dream. And next week I will go to trial again in Bristol on the 6th of May. This time the anti-terrorist prosecutors demand up to 5 years house arrest and special surveillance, which could see me returning to prison frequently. It also has the precedent for the rest of the anarchist space in the UK if the state is successful. International mobilizations are essential for learning about and combining our shared struggles. Opening a space for discussion and praxis enables us to escape the prison walls and barbed wire which divides and isolates us. I'm locked up for 23 hours a day in a solitary cell, subject to enhanced monitoring and censorship, categorized as high risk and placed on the escape list. I could not care less. I will leave this place without stepping back 1 millimeter. One who has a why to live can bear almost any how. Friedrich Nietzsche. There are storms gathering on the horizon. Toby Schoen.
Anarchist and anti-fascist prisoner Dan Baker has issued the following statement in solidarity with anarchist prisoner Toby Schoen, who is facing a control order that has been rejected by a judge. Originally posted to the Anarchist Black Cross Federation. I express my solidarity and support for Toby Schoen, who is being held by the same company, G4S, which captures and holds children in cages. The psychologist here at FCI Memphis asked me why I fast on new and full moons, and I told her that I fast to train my body for hunger strikes, because this is the only way to express bodily autonomy in a totalitarian, dystopian police state. Today is the anniversary of the death of Bobby Sands, Irish political prisoner, who was on hunger strike. Up the friends! I am now receiving mail, but friends like Toby Schoen and Eric King are unable to communicate freely with the outside world, and kept in isolation with meaningless labels of elevated fear. Like Toby, I also face a decade in prison, and I was told I should be grateful for only receiving 44 months of captivity. But Abdullah Öcalan says, "There's nothing more contemptible than a slave who is grateful for their enslavement." After finishing my sentence, I will be on probation and observation for 3 years, which, as Toby said, could see us return to prison on the whims of unscrupulous cops who don't follow their own laws. As Toby said, international solidarity, cooperation, and mobilization is fundamental to successful progress. Before we can dismantle and abolish human captivity, we have to examine our hearts and our minds and uproot the chains of slavery that capitalism has conditioned us to perpetuate through widespread advertising and dependency. I would like everyone to remember Willem von Spronsen, who took a stand against G4S and their abusive enslavement of children in the US, Palestine, and the UK. The martyrs never die. The human spirit that loves truth, freedom, and beauty will never submit to the systems of hierarchy and domination. I admire Toby's statement that will not step back 1 millimeter. Solidarity forever. Dan, a.k.a. Ali Sher.
June 11, like Mercury. Open letter to Dan Baker, a.k.a. Ali Shar, from Toby Schoen. Ali Shar, I heard your message of solidarity. Thank you, it gave me strength. I would turn the energy back with this open letter, and I hope to kick a brick from the walls, one more time. In a flurry of black feathers and lunar wisdom, a murder of crows delivered your statement, and those wily crows told me about your situation in FCI Memphis. I want to add on to this dialogue and talk about 3 anarchist comrades imprisoned in Italy. The first is Anna Beniamino, who is serving a 17-year sentence for the Scriptum Manent case in a high-security regime in Rebibbia prison in Rome. The Scriptum Manent case involved the arrest of 7 anarchists accused of subversive association with terrorist intent in a series of direct actions claimed by the informal anarchist organization, an absurd farce with obscene conclusions. The second comrade I want to mention is Alfredo Cospito, who has been locked up since 2012 for the Adinolfi case, for which he was sentenced to nearly 11 years and is now waiting for the confirmation of another sentence of 20 years for the Scriptum Manent case. Alfredo was recently struck with the legislature 41B special security regime. Each month he can only receive either one phone call for 10 minutes or one visit strictly with family members with glass and recorded. He can only walk in the yard with maximum 3 other prisoners previously approved by the prison security. He cannot receive books. Censorship is applied to his correspondence. Number of letters per month is extremely limited, and he has a very limited amount of items which he can keep in his cell. Several international agencies have continuously condemned the 41B prison regime as torture. The third comrade I want to mention is Juan Soroche. On the date of the International Day of Solidarity with Long-Term Anarchist Prisoners, June the 11th, Juan will face a court hearing in Treviso. Juan is on trial accused of an attack against an office of the Lega Nord political party claimed by the cell Haris Hatzimihalakis, Black International, 1881/2018, that happened in August 2018. Juan, who is already serving time for other judgments, is now facing a long sentence in his other political trial. Like all the imprisoned anarchists around the world, these 3 comrades deserve the support and solidarity that the international anarchist movement can give them. The repression we face is evidence that our struggle has validity, and the enemy is threatened and reactive. Even though we are locked up, our lives continue. Our inner world is still infinitely rich and diverse as we confront our experience. We are part of the same lost continent, and we discover freedom in our own indestructible hearts. Alishar, with our letters, we create an Atlantic bridge where all of us can meet and learn from each other. We anarchists tread the same yards, hear the same keys and slamming doors, but we discuss and plan and don't give up. Dialogues between us are important, as needed as those we have with those outside. I tell you some of my news. Maybe it is because of the solidarity efforts of comrades outside, but I was able to receive a few letters, postcards, and a book. Sarah, Prison Memoirs of a Kurdish Revolutionary by Sakin Kansis. I don't know who sent me the book, but they have my sincere thanks. I received a few letters from Philadelphia ABC sent in the last 2 months, and a couple of cards from Brighton ABC, and a parcel from the NFA ABC in London. That, as well as a few other letters, all arrived in the last few days. I still have a lot of correspondence that I have not yet been given, as well as books. G4S are lying in the face of all this by claiming I have no mail and saying that books are not permitted. In Bristol prison, I was able to receive a copy of My Pestiferous Life by Claudio Lavazza before the administration censored my mail. I recommend Claudio's book. Reading it is like getting a big hug from a dear friend who helped you to escape. Whilst I was in Bristol, comrades from Italy sent me a lunar calendar which was forbidden to me. All anarchists should come to know the pleasure of the dark moon. For an alphabet in flames, let the pen reach into the void. Free Eric King, free everyone. Toby Schoen.
Okay, the title is On the Hierarch Delusion, Abolition in the Future, just in case everybody needs me to say that also. Fewer and fewer people seem to be suffering from the hierarch delusion these days. I say delusion because hierarchy is a diagnosable mental illness. The delusion of hierarchy is dependent upon a number of irrational and illogical premises, all provably and observably false. To be a hierarch is to say that we are better off with the few ruling the many rather than everyone ruling themselves. The argument goes, people are messy and cannot be trusted to self-rule. This is obviously and observably irrational to suggest that we are better off under the rule of a privileged few messy people who have inordinate power concentrated in their hands, as if the concentration of power in the hands of a few messy people will somehow make them less messy rather than more corrupt. This is clearly a delusion, as proven by 8,000 years of hierarchy never working as advertised. To be a hierarch is also to say that we are better off with government, that without government we will experience violence and upheaval, chaos and death. This is obviously and observably irrational to suggest that we are better off under the rule of a privileged few with nukes and aircraft carriers and attack helicopters. A privileged few who do not know our names, let alone what our needs are, and we will somehow experience less violence, upheaval, chaos, and death. This is clearly a delusion, as the Fraternal Order of Police have murdered more people than all of the other gangs in the United States combined, as continuous wars and upheaval and chaos continue to escalate everywhere. School shootings, pandemics, terrorism, war, road rage, suicide, toxicity of the ecosystem, famine, inflation, and all forms of disaster looming on every horizon. This belief that we are better off is clearly a delusion, as proven by 8,000 years of hierarchy never working as advertised. It appears fewer and fewer people are suffering this hierarchy delusion each day. It used to be that everyone accepted that we need government, and that capitalism rewards hard work and merit, and that our system of justice isn't perfect, but it's the best one we've got. Nobody accepts any of that now. Some people go along in self-interest, motivated by practicalities like food rewards, but nobody buys the sales pitch anymore. Our collective mental health is improving. The hierarchy delusion is losing power over us. Millions quit their jobs, simply opting out of the Pharaoh's stone-dragging exercise. Millions more stopped paying rent. An epidemic of flash robberies plagues corporate chain stores like biblical locusts. Hundreds of supply ships linger off the coast with millions and millions of products that require unloading. And nobody gives a shit. Government, capitalism, systems of control have become obsolete and irrelevant to most people. As those in power concentrate more and more authority into fewer hands, as they impose harsher measures to maintain this matrix, more and more people find themselves alienated, disenfranchised, floating like flotsam and jetsam in the wake of this machine. While they likely have no theoretical analysis for their experiences, and while they may not identify as anarchists, they are no longer hierarchs. They may not have a kind of political or ideological framework for tearing down the existing order, but they have resolved to not lift a finger to keep it going. The system is no longer theirs. They have gone from delusional to disillusioned. Their passive withdrawal from hierarchy, while not active opposition, leaves the existing system far more hollow, vulnerable, and unstable. In terms of the prison complex, some states like Virginia are closing prisons and finding ways to divert larger numbers of prisoners to non-prison alternatives, simply for a lack of prison guards. Toledo Correctional in Ohio has long advertised on its sign out front, "Now hiring heroes." It seems they are, more accurately, hiring no one. No applicants are seeking the union-scale jobs. As a consequence, the skeleton crews of the prisons are working double shifts on a regular basis, emotionally exhausted and demoralized, leading to even more attrition. The overtime is crippling the state budgets. Some prisons have reduced themselves to simply carrying out essential activities like feeding meals and dispensing medications. All other programs canceled, maybe forever. Is this a temporary hiccup? Can the larger system recover? Perhaps. It has recovered before. But the real question for those who actively oppose the existence of this system of control is, what can be done now in this very opportune moment to further along the collapse? Abolition is not impossible. In fact, it may even be inevitable. It may be happening all on its own right now and only needs us to help it occur a little faster. What can be done? Well, it isn't brain science or rocket surgery. Imagine yourself the person in charge of these vast and sprawling complexes. Ask yourself, what would you not want to see happen? Then do that. Consider all industrial complexes are dependent upon logistical networks of administrative offices and warehouses and suppliers and distributors to keep those complexes operating. None of those are behind impenetrable walls or fences. None of them are under armed guard by an army. All of them are vulnerable and fragile and flammable. Every location has parking lots. Every vehicle in every parking lot is vulnerable and fragile and flammable. Every vehicle has tires and enters and exits the lots through choke points that are themselves vulnerable. Perhaps with imagination we can develop low-risk and high-yield methods of making these complexes completely unmanageable, ushering in an era where they no longer exist. A great resource that reimagines abolition is available at DetroitABC.org. We own the future. The more we do, the faster it gets here. This is Anarchist Prisoner Sean Swain from the Super Duper Uber Mega Ultra Hyper Turbo Multi Maxi Max in Youngstown, Ohio. If you're listening, you are the resistance.
This is The Final Straw. This show will later be archived at thefinalstrawradio.noblogs.org, and you can email us with questions and suggestions at thefinalstrawradio@riseup.net or thefinalstrawradio@protonmail.com. If you care to, you can send us letters at The Final Straw Radio, P.O. Box 6004, Asheville, North Carolina, 28816. This show is brought to you by Firestorm Books and Coffee. Located at 610 Haywood Road, Firestorm Books and Coffee is a worker-owned co-op in Asheville specializing in offbeat, underground, and independent literature. You can find a catalog of Firestorm's books and zines, plus a full calendar of events up at their website, firestorm.coop.